The world knew Jimi Hendrix as the rock god who spoke to howling amplifiers, who burned his Fender Stratocaster in an offering of pure, untamed rebellion. That silhouette, framed by fire and sound at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, became the definitive image of a generation's liberation. He was the psychedelic shaman, the untouchable maestro whose fingers moved faster than thought itself, redefining what a guitar could be. For the generation that watched him, those who first saw his black and white images flicker on their analog television screens, or heard his vinyl albums hiss to life on massive turntables, he represented a break from every rule they had been taught. He was the sound of the 1960s counterculture, raw, electric, and defiantly loud, a furious rejection of the muted conformity of the prior decade. The power of his sound, the deep saturation of that tube distortion, was a sensory assault that bypassed the intellect and went straight to the soul. But at the same time, backstage, beneath the fading purple velvet and the lingering scent of smoke, he was often a profoundly lonely, insecure young man who was not even guaranteed a clean room to sleep in the next night. The contrast between the public spectacle and the private man was a chasm that eventually swallowed him whole. The nostalgic trigger is immediate for those who lived through that era, 1969. If you were alive then, you remember the gray morning sky of Woodstock, the endless, mud-caked masses waiting for the anthem of a lifetime. The sight of Hendrix, the final act, playing his distorted, agonizing rendition of The Star-Spangled Banner, was not just a performance, it was a cultural pivot, an auditory declaration of independence, anxiety, and defiance against the war machine still raging in Southeast Asia. It was a moment of profound, shared cultural memory, where a whole generation understood implicitly the trauma and the hope embedded in that sound. Yet, behind that legendary burning Stratocaster was a fear that remained a secret for years, a stifling contract, and a silent, consuming pressure that would ultimately cost Jimi his life. Every great artist fears losing control. For Jimi, that control was being taken not only on stage, but it had begun to seep into every waking moment of his last 3 years, driven by external forces and internal demons that his fame only amplified. But then came that final, terrible night in London, an evening that began with the promise of collaboration and ended in stark tragedy. Years later, when the scattered recordings and the whispered testimonies finally emerged, the story turned into something far larger than just Jimi's tragic end. Those other musicians and managers who were there, who had shielded the details for decades, finally began to hint at the truth. 3 simple signatures, a single pill bottle of a heavy sedative, and a locked hotel room door were about to determine how rock history would be written. The final, desperate hours were a culmination of every pressure point of his life, the childhood neglect, the relentless touring, and the crushing weight of the industry. And as the early hours of September 18, 1970, began to unfold, it became clear that within just a few hours, Jimi would either find the freedom he so desperately craved, or his name would be irrevocably transformed into a myth, a cautionary tale for all who followed. The early days were a world away from the bright chaos of the festivals, deeply rooted in the gritty, overcast reality of Seattle. James Marshall Hendrix grew up in the shadow of the Pacific Northwest, a shy, reserved boy whose tumultuous childhood was marked by financial struggle and the emotional void left by his absent mother, Lucille. The family structure was fragmented, unstable, creating a deep-seated insecurity that no amount of fame could soothe. His father, Al Hendrix, a demanding and sometimes distant figure, struggled to raise him, and their relationship was a complex tapestry of affection and misunderstanding that left a lasting scar of never quite feeling good enough, a fear of parental disapproval that haunted his artistic choices. His first instrument was a battered one-string ukulele, and the narrative of his early life is one of an almost desperate yearning for sound, for an escape mechanism that could drown out the quiet anxieties of home. He learned to play on cheap, right-handed guitars, flipped over and restrung to accommodate his left-handed genius, a physical struggle that mirrored the rest of his life, always slightly out of alignment with the world, always forcing the impossible to work. This need to adapt, to constantly fight against the natural order of the instrument, ingrained in him an intuitive understanding of the guitar that no formal training could ever teach. He saw the fretboard not as a map of rules, but as an open canvas for a language only he truly spoke, a language of pure electric blues. The military service, a brief and awkward period meant to avoid legal trouble, was a painful, stifling interlude, characterized by severe boredom and an inherent distrust of authority, a perfect training ground for the counterculture icon he would become, though it was there, however, that he met bassist Billy Cox, planting the seed for future musical collaboration. But the road, the relentless Chitlin circuit that crisscrossed the American South, was a different kind of war, a brutal apprenticeship in the unforgiving world of rhythm and blues. For years, he was a nameless sideman, backing up explosive acts like Little Richard and the Isley Brothers. He was a utility player, bound by the strict codes of R&B performance, precise, disciplined, and utterly lacking the sonic explosion he yearned to unleash. The music was rigid, the routines exhausting, the stage presence demanding, and the pay barely enough to survive, a period that hammered discipline into his playing but left him emotionally hollowed out by the sheer lack of creative outlet, a stifling of the wild genius bubbling beneath the surface. This era taught him showmanship and endurance, yet the creative shackles felt heavy. Behind the scenes of those endless, forgotten gigs, a young Jimi Hendrix, barely making ends meet, found himself drawn to the very things that promised a temporary reprieve from the grueling tour schedule, the amphetamines and alcohol that kept the tired bodies moving, blurring the lines between survival and escape, a habit that began purely out of necessity, not indulgence. The London arrival in 1966 was an explosion, the convergence of an unmatched talent and a cultural moment desperately waiting for a shockwave. Under the wing of Chas Chandler, the transformation was immediate and total. London was a fever dream of mod fashion, psychedelic art, and a rock scene desperate for a catalyst. Jimi was their electric prophet. He was given a stage, a spotlight, and, crucially, the freedom to make all the noise he wanted, to use the full, untamed power of the analog Marshall stacks, the kind of massive, beautiful tube amps that collectors in the target demographic would remember seeking out. The sight of this unassuming American, coaxing alien sounds from his instrument using a primitive wah pedal and intense feedback, was a profound cultural shock to the reigning guitar deities like Clapton and Townsend. It was a perfect storm of timing and talent, a cultural vacuum waiting for a figure to define the chaotic promise of the decade, a vacuum he filled with a sound the world had never conceived. The debut album, Are You Experienced?, was a sonic bomb that shattered the conventions of rock recording, pushing the limits of the 4-track technology of the era, turning simple studio effects into high art. It captured the moment, defining the sound of a generation, a dizzying blend of blues, rock, and otherworldly feedback. It was complex yet visceral, a perfect reflection of the psychedelic era. He was not just a guitarist, he was a sound painter, using the studio as an instrument, mastering techniques like reverse tape delay and extreme panning that baffled his contemporaries. But the rapid, almost violent ascent came with a dangerous price tag. The sheer pressure of maintaining the persona, the wild, articulate, flamboyant, yet profoundly spiritual black rock star in a primarily white, rapidly commercializing genre, was immense. He was forced to move faster, play louder, and always be on for a public that demanded a deity, not a man. The relentless touring schedule, designed to maximize profit from a sudden smash hit, became a suffocating loop that wore down his creative spirit, turning him into a commodity before he could even finish his second album, a cycle of exhaustion that defined the lives of 60s rock royalty. The recording studio was no refuge, the constant need to top the last impossible achievement, to produce a sequel to a masterpiece like Voodoo Child, weighed heavily on him. The famous and notoriously chaotic Electric Ladyland sessions were a testament to this pressure. His studio mastery grew, but so did his perfectionism, often leading him to spend 40 hours on a single guitar tone. He would work for 72 hours straight, driving engineers to the brink of collapse, desperately searching for the sounds that were perpetually just out of reach in his mind, often bringing his latest entourage into the sacred space of the recording booth. The studio engineer, years after the tape stopped rolling and the legend was cemented, confessed that the one phrase Jimi uttered late one exhausted night still woke him from his sleep: "I don't know if I have anything left to say." It was the cry of an artist facing an insurmountable creative wall, while simultaneously being lauded as a genius by millions who only wanted more of the spectacle. The burden of expectation was not simply artistic, it was physical and financial, compounded by the constant drain of legal battles. The sheer volume, the power, and the demanding acrobatics of his live performances required a mental and physical commitment that was exhausting. He was playing 4-hour sets, sometimes twice a night, with inadequate rest, fueled by the era's rampant pharmaceutical solutions for energy, sleep, and anxiety. The intense heat of the stage lights, the demanding logistics of analog touring, where a single piece of broken tube gear could derail a show, compounded the stress. The quiet reality of his addiction was that the guitar was no longer just his freedom, it had become part of a silent, consuming cycle that was slowly beginning to erode his body and his memory. The drugs, initially a tool for maintaining the insane pace, became a master he desperately wanted to escape. The constant flow of people, the hangers-on, the managers, and the women, all seeking a piece of the phenomenon, amplified his essential isolation. He was surrounded by millions, yet profoundly alone. A letter, written by one of the women who passed through his life, a heartbreaking plea for him to slow down, seeing the man fading behind the beads and scarves, slipped under his hotel room door during the darkest days of his career, describing the lonely silence in the eye of his rock and roll hurricane. The business side of the operation was even more insidious, a financial prison disguised as a record deal that would haunt him to his final breath. Rock history is littered with cautionary tales, but Jimi's contract woes were legendary, a labyrinth of pre-experience agreements with manager Ed Chalpin that followed him, strangling his creative freedom and his finances. On the back pages of those record company contracts, the clauses nobody wanted to read aloud stipulated a kind of indentured servitude, tying him to a previous manager long after he had moved on to global fame and fortune with the experience. The notorious 1965 contract with Chalpin demanded a percentage of his earnings until 1974, a suffocating financial chain. Every note he played, every album he sold, was paying off a debt he couldn't outrun, leading to debilitating legal battles that diverted his energy and wealth. This conflict led directly to the brief and creatively frustrated period of the Band of Gypsies and the controversial Live at the Fillmore East album, a contractual obligation that forced him to change his band lineup against his own artistic instincts, forcing him into a style he was trying to leave behind. He was a millionaire on paper, but constantly hounded by lawyers and creditors, fighting battles in courtrooms as well as on stage. When the stage lights finally hit him for those final performances, Jimi found that his fingers were, for the first time, not entirely his own. They were guided by contract law and the need to deliver one more impossible performance to feed a machine that was consuming him. The burden of the Chalpin contract and the ruthless management of Mike Jeffrey, a manager whose methods were often rumored to skirt the edges of legality, created a vortex of stress that no amount of music could escape. Jeffrey, an astute businessman but a terrifying overseer, maintained control by keeping Jimi isolated and financially confused, manipulating his fear of disappointing the audience and the memory of his absent mother. This managerial manipulation, a common and destructive pattern for young stars of the era, was the final screw tightening on Jimi's emotional stability. He craved simplicity, a return to the blues purity of his youth, but was bound to the psychedelic rock spectacle. A story he had long kept hidden about a childhood memory, a profound feeling of abandonment after a relative left him alone, which he only shared in his final, exhausted year, was confided to his inner circle, and in retrospect, it was the real, quiet beginning of his psychological collapse. The pain of his childhood, the search for a maternal figure, and the constant feeling of abandonment were the ghosts that fame could not exorcise, making him profoundly vulnerable to the dark side of the 27 Club mythology. The final months of his life were marked by a desperate, palpable search for authenticity and stability, a search that was tragically thwarted at every turn. He wanted to shed the experience mythos, to explore more complex, jazz-infused, and R&B-influenced sounds, a direction captured in the scattered brilliance of his final studio sessions. He began assembling a new, more fluid lineup, but the pressure to be the voodoo child showman was overwhelming. The machine demanded the spectacle. 100,000 fans cheered as the lights went down, yet in the narrow corridor backstage, Jimi stood, cigarette in hand, repeating a single question to road managers who couldn't answer: "Do I have to set it on fire tonight?" The constant cycle of touring, studio work, and legal battles was a crushing weight. He was the highest-paid act in the world, yet he felt profoundly broke, both financially and spiritually, a dichotomy deeply relatable to the generation that watched their heroes burn out for profit. The summer of 1970 was the final, exhausting crescendo, a tour designed for maximum extraction, not artistic expression. The experience had fractured, reformed, and then fractured again. The last major festival appearance, the Isle of Wight, was a disaster of organization, sound, and a visibly exhausted, sometimes incohesive Jimi. The sheer physical toll was evident, his hands were sometimes shaky, his focus wavering. The crowd, expecting the fiery guitar god, grew impatient with his sometimes lengthy, introspective jams, not understanding that they were witnessing the final act of a deeply tired man, a man whose genius was being suffocated. The performance crisis was real. As the spotlights hit him, Jimi sometimes felt a terrifying sense of disconnection, a horrifying realization that his hands were moving without his conscious command, the electric energy he once channeled now channeling him, burning him out. The promise of a new, creatively free future was agonizingly close. He had been recording new material in his own Electric Lady Studios in New York, a utopian vision of a studio built for an artist, by an artist, a place where he could finally escape the pressures of commercial recording. There was a flicker of hope, the possibility of an escape, a new beginning where he could finally record the sprawling, orchestral masterpiece he envisioned, but it was within arm's reach and cruelly taken by the relentless schedule. The final, fateful European tour was a forced march, the last contractual gasp of the machine that demanded his body on stage, a bitter irony for a man seeking peace. He arrived in London in September, tired, ill, and psychologically fragile. That single night would become a breaking point that would forever change how the rock music industry looked at the artist and the physical body used to create the art, leading to a decade of increased scrutiny and litigation over artist rights. His health was deteriorating, exacerbated by the cocktail of substances he was using to keep pace, including the potent sleeping pills. The evening of September 17, 1970, was spent with friends, moving through various locations, a blur of confusion and increasing sedation. He was last seen at a party, agitated and searching for release from the constant noise in his head. The details are contradictory, conflicting, and incomplete, a narrative built of half-truths, fear, and grief, a chaos of unreliable witnesses and self-interested parties whose stories shifted over time, creating a permanent hole in the historical record. The thread of the hidden truth begins with the revelation of the final, desperate phone calls he made that night to friends, calls that hinted at a deep, existential dread and a desire to simply be done with the entire circus that was his life, not a simple request for a ride or a chat. He was reportedly calling his manager's office repeatedly, trying to cut through the bureaucracy that kept him imprisoned, wanting to renegotiate his fate, but the attempts were futile. The loneliness of that final night was absolute, a man trapped by his own legend, unable to reach genuine help. His final documented hours saw him consuming large doses of Vesperax, a powerful German sleeping medication, prescribed by a doctor who barely knew him, underscoring the haphazard medical care afforded to touring musicians of that era. The official story is that he died in the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill, succumbing to an accidental overdose of sleeping pills, aspirating on his own vomit. Simple. Tragic. End of file, yet every fact surrounding the event seemed designed to obfuscate the real events. But the surrounding testimonies and medical reports were immediately suspect, riddled with inconsistencies that kept the mystery alive for decades, suggesting a far more complex and darker final chapter. The timing of the ambulance call, the disappearance of crucial documents, and the later retraction of testimony by his companion, Monica Danman, all contribute to the myth of a cover-up. Danman's shifting narrative about the exact sequence of events, whether she left him alone, whether he was alive when she called for help, created immediate, lasting doubt among investigators and fans alike. The final mystery is woven into those hours, a Gordian knot of unanswered questions: who was truly with him when the crisis peaked, why was the ambulance called so late by his companion, Monica Danman, and why were the circumstances of his body's discovery so strange, particularly the sheer, fatal amount of red wine found in his lungs and on the bed. The wine, a detail that baffled medical examiners, suggested he had been moved or was unconscious while a massive amount was consumed, a scenario highly unlikely for someone in a sedative-induced stupor, a chilling detail that points toward outside influence or neglect. His manager, the powerful Mike Jeffrey, was a looming figure, a shadowy presence in the narrative, a man with alleged ties to less-than-legal interests and a clear financial motive. The terms of those old contracts meant that Jimi was far more valuable to certain interests dead than alive, ensuring eternal cash flow from his back catalog and insurance policies, a sinister implication that the generation who idolized him still whispers about. The question of agency, of whether Jimi himself chose the path to oblivion or was simply too weakened to fight the forces aligned against him, remains the central tragedy. The truth, when the evidence was later pieced together by investigative journalists and resurfaced testimonies, pointed not to a simple accident, but to a complex tangle of desperation, drug use, emotional fatigue, and the utter failure of his handlers to protect him from the relentless pressure they themselves created. The legal battles over his estate that immediately followed his death only highlighted the predatory nature of the industry he had struggled to escape. The ultimate, heavy historical weight of that moment is that the industry watched as one of its brightest stars was slowly extinguished by the very mechanisms of fame and commercial exploitation that had elevated him, a brutal, final warning shot for the entire rock music ecosystem, proving that artistic genius offered no shield from corporate greed. His fate was a shared trauma for those who lived through the optimism of the 60s and the disillusionment that followed. The final curtain descended not with a crash of feedback, but with a horrifying, lonely silence in a dingy hotel room, far from the stadium lights and the roar of the crowds. Jimi Hendrix was gone, another member of the morbid, mythical 27 Club, a figure consumed by the very intensity that had made him immortal. The cathartic end is not in the death itself, but in the enduring, powerful legacy he left behind, the musical archive that speaks of the man he always intended to be, the spiritual bluesman hidden beneath the psychedelic mantle. The power of his music to survive and thrive is the ultimate act of defiance against the systems that destroyed him. The image of his death, isolated and medicated, became the dark coda to the summer of love. The unreleased tapes that surfaced after his death, the last attempts at a new musical direction, the studio notes filled with drawings and lyrical fragments showing a profound shift in creative focus, speak to the freedom he was fighting for, a sound that the world was tragically denied. He was moving towards jazz fusion and funk, an exploratory path that would have influenced the entire next decade of music. His music, the sheer, explosive genius of it, remains the counter-narrative to his end, a defiance that lives on in the grooves of the vinyl. He played a right-handed guitar left-handed, fought an industry with an acoustic sensibility, and died because the myth became too powerful for the man to contain, yet the music outlived the myth. The echoes of his riffs, the sheer, unadulterated tone, the impossible bends, the revolutionary use of the wah pedal, still reverberate through every genre of music, influencing countless musicians from funk to heavy metal. His ability to fuse the raw electricity of rock with the deep, visceral soul of the blues created a vocabulary that remains essential. His image, defiant and artistic, became a symbol of the generation that refused to conform, a touchstone for those who saw music as a vehicle for social change, not just entertainment. An album recorded in a few months, featuring his impossible, boundary-smashing sound, is still the first record a young guitarist will reach for, a memory of a time when music didn't just entertain, it changed the world and offered an intense, brief escape from the anxieties of the Vietnam era, a feeling only those who lived through it can truly comprehend. The cultural memory of those analog sounds, those overdriven tubes, and the sheer audacity of his performance continues to define rock's potential, linking the generation of the 60s directly to the sound of today. The legacy of Jimi Hendrix is not merely a collection of hit songs, it is the blueprint for modern electric expression, a cultural monument built on feedback and fire. The equipment he favored, the Stratocaster, the Marshall stacks, the fuzz face pedal, became sacred relics, defining the sound of rock for decades. The meticulous analog recording techniques he pioneered in his own studio, Electric Lady, set a standard for sonic ambition that influenced everyone from Pink Floyd to Prince. He elevated the recording studio from a simple capture device to a canvas for limitless sonic experimentation. The cultural impact transcended music. He was a political statement, a racial pioneer in a predominantly white genre, and a spiritual guide for millions seeking truth outside of established institutions. The questions linger, as they always do with figures of such magnitude. What if he had been free of those contracts? What if Chaz Chandler had never left, providing the protective buffer that he desperately needed? What if someone had intervened, truly and deeply, in those final months, recognizing the deep spiritual and physical exhaustion? The subsequent decades of revelations from former roadies and associates only deepened the conviction among his original fanbase that the full truth was still being actively suppressed, fueling the enduring mythology. The music itself offers the only real answer, a continuous, screaming, utterly honest expression of a man who was fighting to be heard over the noise of his own fame, a pure signal of artistic intent cutting through the commercial static. That musical honesty is his enduring gift, the unfiltered sound of a genius wrestling with destiny. Jimi Hendrix remains the symbol of both the glorious promise and the tragic failure of the 1960s counterculture, a brief, incandescent flare that burned out far too quickly, leaving behind a silence that forever changed the sound of rock and roll and serving as a permanent reminder of the fragile line between genius and exploitation. His brief, beautiful, and devastating life remains one of the most powerful lessons in music history, a story of an impossible talent crushed by the weight of its own commercial success. The memory of his tone, that transcendent roar from the guitar, continues to call across the decades, an echo of freedom that can never be truly silenced.